7th and Townsend Farms, the call to arms was heard by one and all. From every land they came to stand and answer freedom's call. 'Twas long ago we faced the foe, the old brigade and me, and by my side they fought and died that white men might be free. Where are the men who stood with me when history was made? How longingly I want to see the boys of the old brigade. The two boss men landed at the local airport, since the Dalles had no municipal air lanes on its power grid, and from there they drove by street into the picturesque hillside town. Kahl High School stood in imposing red brick on a spacious campus, perched commandingly over the broad expanse of the Columbia River and the Tom Watson Dam and hydroelectric plant. A long flight of wide wooden steps led down to the riverside. Where Redmond glanced over, he could see some docks, some small boats, some prefabricated buildings, and a Kriegsmarine pennant. A number of young men were doing some kind of boat drill down along one wooden quay. Redmond recalled that Kahl High prided itself, A. Covington, in their corps of naval cadets. The two cops left their car in the parking lot and wandered into the school looking for Lars Frierson. In the hall just outside the principal's office, Don glanced over the bulletin board and saw a large pink pastel flyer posted from the school's guidance counselor. "Senior girls, is the marriage track right for you?" it read. "Under the new Family Enhancement Act passed by Parliament in January, you can now earn C1 citizenship on marriage and a promotion to 2-vote B category on the birth of your first child. Representatives from the Ministry of Labor's Home Employment Department will be at GKHS on November 1st to conduct seminars on the new range of homemakers' benefits and child allowances, and also on continuing education for homemakers. On November 2nd and 3rd, Oregon Introductions, Inc. will be on campus in the band room from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. taking applications. Oregon Introductions, Inc. has over 3,000 bachelors on file in Oregon and Washington gentlemen who want to meet you. All age ranges, all religious affiliations, and all citizenship categories, including over 50 Alpha Class citizens and party members. All carefully screened and psychologically profiled, etc., etc. The two security agents found the principal in his office and identified themselves. Mr. Rogers was a small, neat-looking man in his 30s. His hair was parted down the middle, and he was dressed in one of the new old-fashioned suits out of Seattle that looked about circa 1910, with a high wing collar, narrow cravat, and broad lapels, on which he wore the Operation Strikeout campaign ribbon. Redmond noted with amusement that the archaic fashions the government promoted actually seemed to be catching on more among young people here than up in Olympia. Some of the girl students wore long pleated skirts with wide leg-of-mutton sleeves, and some of the boys were sporting straw boaters, bow ties, and Oxford wingtips. "Fascinating," he said with a chuckle, peering through the glass office at the students passing by outside in the hall. "By God, those warlocks in the Mo-See are actually doing it. They've created a time machine. They're turning back the clock clothing-wise. Considering that the big fashion statement among kids their age in American classrooms is now full nudity, and they've just won Supreme Court backing for it, I'd say the Ministry of Culture is doing a slap-up job," replied Rogers wryly. "To be honest, I think the girls at least look a lot prettier in those long dresses with the braids than in bobby socks or that drab 1930s look," put in Nell. "I think bobbed hair on women looks crappy." "You're not here for Ted Spears, are you?" asked Rogers with some alarm. "We only discovered it yesterday. Ted came forward and confessed, and I intend to punish him severely, suspension and detention for the rest of the semester, plus expulsion from the football team. Surely nobody called boss about a simple practical joke, however tasteless." "No, we're not here after Ted, whoever he is." "Why, what did he do?" asked Nell. "He and two other boys, whom to give him due credit he honorably declines to name but whose identities I know quite well, got drunk and played a very stupid practical joke," said Rogers in exasperation. "There's a large formal photograph of President Morgan in the main foyer, which you may have seen as you came in. That's new. We had to replace the old one. Ted and the others brought beer into the locker room and consumed it after football practice. Rather a lot of it. They subsequently went into the art room, got scissors and cut up a watercolor done by one of our more talented Christian students. Then they went into the foyer, took down the photo of the state president, and mutilated it most shockingly. They cut out his head and replaced it with the head of Satan from the student's painting. The girl is very upset. It's true Ted's family are old believers, but the other two are Christians. I am sure there was no religious message or incitement intended, Rogers hurried to assure them. It was just a drunken prank. How long before anyone noticed? Asked Redmond, trying to suppress a grin. 3 days, admitted Rogers shamefacedly. If you don't mind a suggestion, read those guys the riot act and make them apologize to the girl whose property they destroyed, then give them extra work or detention or whatever. But don't gut your football team and don't worry about any religious or political issues, said Redmond. It's not that big a deal, and no one wants to. H. Covington make it one. Teenage kids kick up the traces sometimes. This isn't the United States anymore, thank God, and we don't lock up children for political incorrectness. Take my word for it, Corby Morgan is big enough not to take offense at some drunk kid taking the mock, and it isn't the first time he's been compared to the devil. And you might remind those young men what happened to kids their age 40 years ago who dared to make jokes at the expense of politically protected minorities. He thought of 17-year-old Trudy Griner thrown into living hell by the Americans for daring to make fun of a sacred perversion. After what they did to her, how could she take any amount of money from them? Redmond wondered, not for the first time. It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't jibe with everything we know of her character. We want to speak to one of your teachers, Lars Frierson. He's not in any trouble, we just need some background from him. A case has come up that involves some rather shady goings-on during the War of Independence, and he remembers some of the people and events in question. Lars is our history and moral philosophy teacher, Rogers told them. To be frank, he's the best I have ever seen. Who better than an Olympic flying column veteran to instruct our children in the foundations of our state and our society? We're very proud to have him. His 6th period class is just starting, I believe. That's our prize senior group, every one of them on track for eventual alpha citizenship, or else I'm very much mistaken. Presuming they pass Mr. Frierson's course, and he checks them off as having the basic understanding of moral principles necessary to assume the duties of citizenship in the Republic, Nell reminded him. Yes, that's true. I'm sure he wouldn't mind if you sat in. They entered Frierson's classroom on the 2nd floor quietly, the principal with them. Frierson looked up from his blackboard, caught the principal's thumbs up, nodded to the two newcomers, then without a second glance went on with his class. He was a lean and hard old man, hatchet-faced, and a curved white mustache that was not quite a handlebar framed his upper lip. Unlike all the rest of his students who were dressed in neat linen shirts and blouses and all wearing ties, including the girls. Frierson wore a dark blue turtleneck sweater and a tweedy jacket with leather patches on the elbows. 1970 meets 1910, whispered Redmond to Nell. This 20th century fashion revival business can get weird. Would you rather have them all naked, like in the United States? Whispered Nell back. How silly can those people get, I wonder? Even after all that has happened in the last century, is there no limit to how insane they can become or how low they can sink? None whatsoever, replied Redmond. Oh, excellent. This must be some of the NS part of the course. On the board, Lars Frierson had written, 10 Principles of National Socialist Thought. Frierson touched a button, and the 10 principles appeared on a large screen above the blackboard. Be honest. A National Socialist faces a fact whether he likes it or not. Dishonesty is the mark of the enemy. National Socialism above all represents living truth in its purest form. Second, believe in God and yourself. The God of destiny subjects only his strongest mortals to enormous tasks which would crush lesser men. God wills only the best to fulfill the highest task of life, to perfect mankind. Give yourself utterly unto destiny, and God will shield you in your fight. God helps only those who help themselves. We will lose only if we lay down our arms, due to our weakness and cowardice. There is only one true disgrace, submission to the enemies of our race. Third, be faithful to your race. No one must be allowed to spoil what nature created down through eons of racial evolution. Your highest purpose in life is to carry on that evolution toward a stronger, better, more beautiful mankind. The purity and strengthening of the Aryan race is the basic requirement of every future higher evolution. Fourth, fight for your race. Fight for the holy ideals of National Socialism, the heart of your great race. Only in this struggle can you prove your true worth as a man or a woman. Only thus can you fulfill your potential for courage, dedication, and ennobling self. Sacrifice. Life's struggle for survival brought man upwards from the ape-like beings of the distant past to the height of Aryan culture and achievement. The party's struggle will produce the revolutionary elite, who will lead the National Socialist ideal to victory. Fifth, you are a superior individual. You will be outnumbered in this struggle, because the best are always a minority. History-making decisions have never been the work of formless masses, but always victories by active and dedicated minorities. You are both the servant and the spokesperson for your race. Make sure you set an example worthy to be followed in your person and your life. Sixth, love your brothers and sisters. You owe your existence to your racial family. Let your love of them be your overriding passion in life. Do not fear the undermen, the racially inferior, and do not persecute them. You are their superior, but you are not their owner. When the time comes to fight them, do not lose your senses through counterproductive hatred. Detach yourself, clear your mind, and destroy them completely, methodically, clinically, as if in a surgical operation. Nothing is more pointless than wasting time hating mud people. It detracts from the positive love of your own. Seventh, improve your brothers and sisters. All Aryan men and women are your brothers and sisters, although not all are equally intelligent or courageous. It is up to you to inform them, to encourage them, and to instill their hearts with courage. Some of your kinsfolk have been misled and made ugly by the Judaic evil which is corrupting our racial soul. You must not hate them on that account, but rather strive to bring them back to their racial family. Eighth, reject the decadence. Decadence is anything which detracts either physically or spiritually from the health and the upward development of our Aryan race. You must hold your racial and spiritual purity above your very life, and not associate with anything which is decadent, or which gives your life the appearance of decadence. Every aspect of life must be judged in relation to the survival and improvement of your race. Anything hindering these attainments must be ruthlessly rooted out and destroyed. Ninth, the best must rule. All great achievements on earth are the product of great leadership, political or scientific or artistic. The racial community can gain strength only by applying the leadership principle and placing in front the men and women who have demonstrated superior ability, dedication, and tenacity in the racial struggle. Democracy is a sickness that leads inevitably to chaos, corruption, and the collapse of society. From democracy steps forth the cruelest of tyrants. 10th, nothing is impossible. Where there is a will, there is a way. Everything falls before the man of indomitable will. Suffering and sacrifice are necessary. We are hardening ourselves for the most decisive struggle in all of human history. Victory will fall only to the most truthful, the most fanatical, the strongest, the bravest, and the best. Be that. Right, let's see if any of you read your homework assignments, Frierson said to his class, turning around. Who wrote the 10 principles? Mr. Walker. No one knows for sure, sir, said one of the teenaged boys. They have been attributed to Commander Rockwell, but they're not really in his writing style. Some say the old man wrote them, but he always denied it, said he just found them in his mail one day back in the 1990s sometime. They've also been attributed to David Myatt, Colin Jordan, and some others, but no one has ever been able to prove authorship one way or the other. H. A. Covington. True, rapped Frierson. Aside from the Cotswolds Declaration of 1962, the 10 principles are considered to the best short exposition of the National Socialist worldview yet formulated. What we are concerned with in this course is not their history, but whether or not you understand these principles, as well as the others that have been taught to you in this classroom and elsewhere, all throughout your lives. Not necessarily agree with them, but understand them sufficiently to be able to take on the duties of responsible citizenship. What's not to understand? Asked another boy. These things seem pretty straightforward to me. Yes, Mr. Malone, they are straightforward enough, agreed Frierson. But the truth and the power of these principles lies not in their straightforwardness, but in their depth. There is more to them than meets the eye, although it is sometimes difficult for your generation to understand why that is. You young ladies and gentlemen have had the unparalleled good fortune to grow up in a sane, stable, and racially homogeneous society. You can read in books and hear from old codgers like me what life was like before the Revolution, when this country was part of the American Empire. You can read and you can hear our stories, but you cannot know. You cannot imagine what it is like to live, or rather to try to exist, in a world consisting in its entirety of lies, a world of unspeakably vile sexual perversions which by law I am not even allowed to describe to you, even had I any desire to do so, which I do not. A kleptocracy, quite literally rule by criminals, some of whom were so bad and so blatant they were even indicted under the Americans' own laws. A world based on no foundation other than sheer greed, wallowing in the most gross and despicable material gluttony. A wasteland of spiritual emptiness, moral corruption, and cultural pollution. An entire society that was based on a bizarre and grotesque moral inversion, the utterly ridiculous and thoroughly evil idea that all humanoid creatures are in some manner equal. "Sir, I've never gotten that," asked one of the girls curiously. "How could anyone even pretend to believe something that silly? It's like claiming the sun rises in the west, something that just obviously isn't true. All men and women are not equal. Some are smarter, some are faster, some are stronger, some are more spiritual, some have more sense of humor, some can wiggle their ears. And when you look at the history of civilization, you see the same thing in the races of mankind and what they created, or didn't create. Europe conquered Africa, not the other way around. Was that supposed to be accidental? I just can't see how the American ruling elite, even as stupid and corrupt as they were, could ever deny the clear truth about race. They denied it because it was in their economic and political interest to do so, Miss Corelli, said Frierson. The answer lies in the essential Judaic worldview which rules most of the world today, but which up until 40 years ago ruled all of it, materialism. Or secular humanism if you want to get fancy about it. If you are of the Christian faith, as many of you are, you would define it as the ancient struggle as to who shall rule the human soul and determine the destiny of humanity, man himself, or God. If you are a national socialist, you would hold that man is a part of nature, while the American way teaches that he exists, apart from it and above it, and therefore is immune to nature's laws. Materialism, ladies and gentlemen. The worldview of man as an economic animal rather than as a spiritual being with a soul. We went over this a couple of weeks ago, but I know the application here can be a bit obscure. Let us refresh our memories a bit. What are the two great philosophical and geopolitical manifestations of Judaic materialism? Mr. Korsov. Capitalism and communism, said a young Russian boy, his English good but accented. That is correct. And what is the dialectic basis of both these materialistic philosophies? Continued Frierson, striding up and down the aisles holding his yardstick like a sergeant major's baton. Miss Stridham, both communism and capitalism are based on the presumption that man is not a spiritual being but an economic unit of production and consumption, recited the Afrikaner girl from memory. Precisely. They teach that every individual man and woman has, in the final analysis, only an economic existence. It therefore follows that there can be no right and wrong, only the economically profitable and the economically unsound. To both monopoly capitalism and Marxist socialism and all its variegations, man as an individual is anathema. He is a component in a great machine to be. H. A. Covington. Fueled and worked until worn out and then thrown away and replaced. Preferably replaced with a cheaper and more durable unit with a brown skin. The only significant difference between these two philosophies is which clique gets the profit of mankind's labor, the privately owned multinational corporations, or the corporate and bureaucratic state. The friends of the captain or the friends of the crew, as Commander Rockwell put it. Towards the end of the last century, there were virtually no meaningful differences between allegedly communist and capitalist societies anywhere in the world except in levels of efficiency. Granted, in most capitalist societies, ordinary people did enjoy a somewhat higher standard of living, although in the present era even that has leveled out as the United States and most of Europe have become part of the Third World racially, economically, and culturally. But getting back to the question of how the American ruling elite could propagate an idea so clearly wrong-headed and pernicious as racial equality, remember that in the context of the times, it was in their interest to do so. Leaving aside the spiritual element for a moment, What was the economic rationale behind the American imperial establishment importing millions of third-world immigrants into North America during the last half of the 20th century? Mr. Spears, we haven't heard from your diabolical wit today. There was a ripple of laughter throughout the classroom. No doubt you can give us some fiendishly clever answer to that question. Cheap labor, sir, replied a blond young man stiffly, apparently unappreciative of the reference to his drunken prank with the devil's head cut out. The same reason they used feminism to pour millions of women into the workforce beginning in the 1960s. To create a vast pool of cheap labor for capitalism that would keep wages down and be much more easily manipulated than the traditional white male blue-collar working class. There were also social engineering and cultural objectives as part of the larger Judeo-liberal agenda, involving the planned phasing out of the traditional family unit based on Christian values, and its replacement by sexually perverse and non-white substitutes that would be more brittle, less cohesive, and have less resistance to exploitation. The ultimate objective was to create a uniformly materialistic world based on the accumulation of the most massive profits possible, through the amalgamation of all the races of mankind into one brown-skinned, raceless, cultureless mass that would have no religious or cultural heritage at all, and would respond to whatever the Judeo-liberal ruling elite programmed into them. Correct, Mr. Spears, said Frierson. I am grateful that you have found the time to fit reading your homework assignment into your recent career of drunken japery. Now, having read it in the textbook, do you know what it means? I think I do, sir, said young Spears. It means Zog wanted to turn the whole world into an ant farm. They still do, not entirely an original thought, but succinct and correct, agreed Spears. You definitely grasp the concept. Zog's master plan, a plan built up through almost 2 centuries of social and political consensus among the ruling classes of the Western world, was and is to create a whole brave new world, as it was called. New World Order, called out one of the kids. Yes, it was also sometimes called the New World Order, conceded Frierson. We'll get into this in somewhat more depth when we cover the Illuminati in Nesta Webster's work. It is a vision on the part of the Anglo-Zionist ruling class that has very seldom been explicitly articulated, except sometimes almost by accident. Every now and then the bastards let the masks slip. If any of you should ever get a chance to see an old movie entitled Soylent Green, I heartily recommend it. It is a largely forgotten and highly underrated classic that is sometimes shown on late-night television these days. Made around 1973, I think. If you ever want to get a glimpse of what the revolution saved you and your descendants from, catch this flick. Soylent Green portrays the nightmare world that the unholy alliance of Zionism, capitalism, and liberalism sought to create. It was to be a world where a small little group of fantastically wealthy people live in unimaginable luxury. They would rule over a polluted and decayed planet consisting of billions of brown wage slaves, almost insect-like in their mindless conformity, existing in the very conditions of squalor and poverty which exist today in most places outside the Republic. Worker ants who would never revolt because they didn't know anything better. Conditions in the United States haven't quite reached the Soylent Green level, but they're getting there. The mud-colored helots of America have no religion except things like the H. A. Covington, Ronald M.C. Donald cult. They have no language except the primitive Spanglish patois, which is now the lingua franca of the states, and most of the remaining whites are now illiterate. They have no concept of history other than politically correct horse manure that Zog spoon-feeds them about warrior bimbos wearing armored bikinis and ridiculous lies about all the great men and women of history all being colored, Jewish, Marxist, feminist, sexually perverted, or some combination of all the above. That is what the greatest tyranny the earth has ever seen spent almost a century preparing for. Laying the groundwork, slicing away the rights and the freedoms of white Americans and Canadians thin slice by slice. All leading toward the day when the world would become one huge global plantation, while Massa Jaime and the international bankers sat on the verandas of the corporate mansions, with mint juleps and designer cocaine cocktails in their hands. They have almost succeeded everywhere else on Earth but here. But how could the white people of that time just sit there and take it? Demanded one of the girls passionately. Couldn't they see what was coming? The old man and others like Commander Rockwell and Pastor Miles warned them. Why didn't they do something? Ah, there it is. The great question, said Frierson softly. Miss Hanson, for the past century, both before and after the Revolution, some of the greatest minds of our civilization have devoted whole lifetimes and lengthy scholarly works to the investigation and analysis of that very question. Why did the white man do nothing, while everything he created, everything he held dear, the entire world that he had mastered was systematically undermined, broken and destroyed by the Jew and those who served the Jew? I have no doubt we will still be studying the problem 100 years from now. I have no simple answer for you. No one knows. But we damned well better find out what went wrong in our minds and our souls, so that we can make sure it never ever happens again. As to the second part of your question, well, the fact is that we did do something, Miss Hanson, said Frierson somberly, touching the War of Independence ribbon on his lapel. Almost too little, almost too late. Too late indeed to save all of America, but enough to build ourselves an ark to weather the great flood of mud, to the everlasting glory of God and the redemption of our racial honor, at the 11th hour, the 59th minute, and the very last second, madam. We did do something. There was a short silence. Do you know that there was one volunteer who was only 12 years old when he was sworn into the NVA, continued Frierson with a smile. Oh, come on, sir. One of the boys couldn't resist interjecting. 12 years old? Yes, Mr. Jardine, 12. The former volunteer I refer to came into this room a few minutes ago and is sitting in the back along with that other gentleman. May I introduce Colonel Donald Redmond of the Bureau of State Security, and the gentleman with the somewhat weather-beaten countenance who is— Sergeant Nell, spoke up Henny. Ah, yes, Sergeant Hendrik Nell, who recently defeated the former NDF Bare Knucks middleweight champion Ross Manless after a thrilling 47 rounds, winning me 350 credits from the sports pool down at the 10 Bells, I might add. Any chance I could persuade you to give some of our school's boxing team some pointers, Sergeant? The youthful heads of the whole class turned to look at Don and Henny sitting quietly in the back. Don's lips pursed in a smile. Trying to throw me off balance, is he? Don chuckled to himself. Don't worry, we haven't come for young Mr. Spears, Don called out. There was a chorus of laughter in the class. And actually, if we're being completely accurate here, there was another volunteer who was 11 when she took the oath. We start teaching them to shoot at 10 nowadays in the public schools, Frierson said, speaking more to Don than to the class. Although I am glad to say most families start their children younger than that, at home. My 8-year-old has a permission slip from his mother and I to attend shooting class with the 5th graders. He loves playing Little Willie with his, said Redmond. You know, the kids' game on the elementary school ranges where Little Willie hides behind his lawyer and you have to pop him when he peeps out from behind the armored briefcase? The bell rang and cut short the possibility that Don would be dragged up to the podium by the teacher and asked to give an impromptu lecture on his experiences during the revolt for H. Covington, which he was grateful. The students rose and gathered their books, gazing at Don and Henny curiously as they left. Frierson came forward and shook Don's hand. Sorry, Colonel Redmond, Sergeant Nell. I couldn't forbear the temptation to let my students know we had a couple of celebrities in our midst. I recall seeing you at several of the old fighters' functions, and you may recall that Bill Vitale introduced us once. I got your message saying you wanted to talk to me, but I wasn't sure when I should expect you. Do you want to come down to the teacher's lounge? Do you have another class, Colonel Frierson? Asked Redmond. No, school's out, and I'm through for the day, said Frierson. And Colonel is my reserve rank. At Kahl High, I'm Mr. Frierson. Then we can just have a seat here. They did so, and Frierson accepted the gift of one of the rolled Havanas. Nell declined, being a non-smoker. Don lit his own cigar and said, This won't take too long. Mr. Frierson, something has come up which properly seems to belong to the past, but which may have a very important effect on this country's future. I need to speak with you about the events surrounding the ambush and destruction of the Olympic flying column at Ravenhill Ranch. Frierson's brow furrowed and his face grew grim. I think you know I'll give you any help I can, Colonel, but what the hell could what could Ravenhill possibly have to do with the price of eggs today? My God, it's been almost 40 years. There are kids in this school whose parents weren't even born then. The state president has received a letter from Trudy Griner, Redmond informed him. From Trudy Griner. Frierson stared and was silent for a long moment. And has this letter been authenticated? He demanded intensely. As best we can do so, yes. It may be a forgery of some kind, some O&R trick we haven't figured out yet, but we are proceeding on the assumption that the letter is authentic. In that letter, Trudy Griner asserts her innocence of the charge of treason which has been traditionally leveled against her. She denies that she was responsible for the destruction of the Olympic flying column, and she says she wants a public trial or court-martial. She furthermore states that she is going to celebrate Independence Day this year by walking across the border at Mountain Gate into the Republic, whereupon we will all hear the rusty screech of a gigantic can of worms opening. Trudy Griner claims that she is innocent? Asked Frierson, stunned. Christ, how could she? I thought that boss had pretty much nailed her as the recipient of that $1 million. There are some odd things coming to light about that, said Redmond. I need to learn everything I possibly can about what happened at Ravenhill that day. I am also interested in learning whatever you can tell me about a meeting which was held the night before the ambush at a house in Hoodsport that the NVA used as an assembly point. Whatever treachery led to the destruction of the column, it almost certainly had its origins at some point during that meeting. I was there for most of the meeting, recalled Frierson, his eyes dimming as he let his mind wander back into the past. I was a fairly senior volunteer. And how did you get involved with the racial resistance originally, sir? Asked Nell. How did you end up joining the NVA? We're asking everybody that by way of background. Yes, sir, said Redmond. You understand that I'm trying to get as broad an overview as possible of the people involved in those events. You never know what may turn out to be significant. So when and how did you become racially aware? Oh, I'm one of those NS from birth types who were fairly common in those days, said Frierson with a reminiscent smile. Drawing swastikas all over everything from the time I was 6 years old. Desperate to find and watch every movie I could find about Holocaust, too, just so I could catch a glimpse of that coal scuttle helmet and hear German spoken. Yeah, same here, replied Redmond. My wife is a witch, and she tells me that people like that are the reincarnated souls of the millions of soldiers and civilians of the Third Reich, who were cut off from life prematurely and violently during the Second European Holocaust. We gravitated naturally towards right-wing causes and ideologies because we left unfinished business behind in Germany. H. A. Covington. Be that as it may, it was always obvious to me even from my childhood that something was very badly wrong in the world, said Frierson. I was NS from a very young age, and involved quite young as well, although not very constructively. I started out as a teenage skinhead back in Atlanta, believe it or not, although I got those ridiculous tattoos removed many years ago, he chuckled. Never a Piercy? Asked Redmond. No. Even when I was a teenager, it was obvious to me Piercism was nothing but a cult with a guru sitting up in a remote mountain ashram clipping coupons, said Frierson. I wanted action. I was arrested a number of times for various drunken escapades as a skinhead, which is one reason I was a bit hard on Ted Spears just now. You heard what he— Yes, Principal Rogers told us, Redmond told him. I just want to make sure the boy understands that he has reached an age when things like that have consequences and they can stay with him. Through a combination of luck and a grandmother who doted on me and was wealthy enough to hire top-notch legal counsel, I got off with only a few short jail terms. Then one day I got hold of a leaflet from the Northwest Agency, The Fundamental Principles of Northwest Migration, and it hit me like a thunderbolt. This was it, never a doubt in my mind before or since. I hit the books like hell and brought my sats up to 1,400, conned Gran into paying for my tuition at the University of Oregon, and then one glorious day I was on a plane for Eugene. I completed my first year at university, and then I went into the underground. I was with Murdoch from the very beginning, when the old man swore us in on 1022 at Coeur d'Alene. Tom and I went off together and hijacked a gasoline tanker as our first revolutionary combat action. When did you first hear about the planned attack on Port Orchard? Asked Nell. Not until we reached the Hoodsport safe house, replied Frierson. We got the order to assemble there the day before. I was responsible for fitting out a pickup truck we'd gotten hold of as a scout vehicle for the column, putting on fake license plates, making sure we had enough gas, and that we had basic weapons and first aid supplies. The purpose of a scout vehicle was to report any enemy activity or blockages on the road ahead when the column was moving. The Hill of the Ravens. By vehicle, and if necessary run interference for them while they escaped and evaded, Can you recall anything special about the meeting in Hoodsport on that particular night? Asked Redmond. They were all special, Colonel, said Frierson somberly. We were a band of brothers and sisters, and we lived every moment of our lives as if it were our last together. Then finally that night it was our last. Every time we got together to plan an operation, we knew that there was a better than even chance that some of us would be dead within 24 hours. That awareness tends to concentrate the mind. The memory of that meeting is especially poignant to me, in view of what happened later on that very morning. I have often thought about it, dreamed about it, that last time we were all together. We were all pretty excited about the new mortar technique. We all wanted to be there when Drago and Frank Palmieri set off the 16 mortar tubes, but we knew that wouldn't be possible. Our job was to move in and surround the courthouse and complete what the mortars started with small arms fire and RPGs. Our objective was to make sure that not one single attorney or federal got out alive, but all of us were looking forward to the mortars, seeing lawyers blown sky high. Joe Cord and Ron Nolan made a study from available media archives on the internet on several occasions in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when the Provisional IRA had used that particular weapon, and they felt it was feasible. With 16 tubes in each homemade mortar shell packing a 200-pound warhead of homemade gelignite, we would be able to deliver over 1.5 tons of heat right over the razor wire and the concrete abutments, and right down onto the heads of dozens of legal leeches, judges, and federal thugs. As it turned out, 4 of our comrades were able to simply ram the truck through the front door and detonate the payload. The stupid fools had prepared for everything except an out-and-out frontal attack. They never thought we'd have the courage to go right up against them, head-on. Yes, we have already spoken to Minister Palmieri, and we will be interviewing the Missy Canlisses later on, said Redmond. That part of it seems fairly straightforward, sir. What I am more interested in is the meeting that took place at the Hoodsport safe house the previous night. Can we get back to that? If there is any clue to be, H. Covington found as to what Trudy Griner intends to spring on us, it seems to me it must be found there. What time did Trudy Griner arrive at the meeting that night? If memory serves, a little past midnight, said Frierson. I remember that we weren't sure when she was getting there, and there was also a little bit of concern, because her cell phone was on the fritz. Did that excite any suspicion? Asked Redmond. No, it was legit. Trudy had one of those crappy Chinese Astras, and their communications satellite had actually crashed into the South Atlantic that very morning. Quality Sino-Israeli workmanship. It was all over the media because all the thousands of Astras were dead as well as Trudy's. In any case, Trudy checked her phone with Ed M.C. Canlis like we all did, and he made sure that, working or not, it was turned off. The idea being that an incoming call might give away the location of the phone to some of Fatty's hotshot electronic surveillance. I never noticed that it was all that effective, but we took precautions anyway. For example, we ran metal detectors and voltage sensors over everyone who attended the meeting to make sure no one was wearing a wire or had any kind of subdural bugging devices planted beneath their skin. Couldn't the NVA afford to give her a decent cell phone that worked? Asked Nell. After all, she was more or less in charge of their support unit. The cheap phone was an important part of her cover, explained Frierson. Trudy was supposed to be a secretary for a temp agency making $23,000 a year. If she'd been stopped and found to be in possession of a $6,000 phone that accessed a worldwide grid through a decently constructed Eurosatellite, it would have been a break in pattern that would have tipped off any sharp counterterrorism cop that something wasn't kosher, in every sense of the term. So she arrived at a little past midnight. Were you present during the whole time during that meeting, Mr. Frierson? Yes, I was assisting McCandless on security, Frierson told them. I sat in a corner with headphones on, listening to a souped-up police scanner, going up and down through the frequencies, listening for any kind of traffic or chatter that might have seemed out of place, or might indicate they were onto us. Murdoch was jumpy with all of our force being in a single place, so he wanted me to keep my ears on. The result was that I couldn't actually hear much of what was being said, but I had a good view of them all.
Can you recall anything at all about that meeting which might have indicated that anything was about to go wrong?
Trudy Griner or anyone else acting suspiciously, asking unusual questions. Anything that would indicate who the informant was if it wasn't Trude? Asked Frierson. No, Colonel, to be honest I can't. Oh, we were all pretty hyped. This was going to be a major action. We were trying out a new weapon against the enemy, and we knew we had the chance of striking a major blow. Those cell phones, said Nell, his brow furrowed. You say they were all turned off. You say you were in the meeting for most of the time. Were you there at about 2 o'clock? Yes, Sergeant, I was. Why? Asked Frierson. Was Trudy Griner still in the room at 2 o'clock? Asked Redmond keenly. Yes, I believe she was, confirmed Frierson. What time did Trudy Griner leave the meeting? Asked Redmond. Can you give us any kind of concrete time for that? As best I can recall, it was a little past 3, said Frierson. What vehicle was she driving when she left? Asked Redmond. Her own car, a white Nissan, I believe it was. She had something to do before she reported to the aid station in Polsbo. Do you know what that was? Asked Redmond. Possibly pick up the van that was to be used as the ambulance for the wounded if necessary?
No, I can't say for sure, but whatever it was, Murdoch seemed to know about it, and he was okay with it, replied Frierson with a distant look, obviously straining his brain to remember. She was supposed to be there at the aid station at 7 in the morning. She never showed. Why? Is the time that important?
Yes, sir. It may well prove to be crucial. We know that the enemy commanding officer, Major Woodrow Coleman, of the Federal Anti-Terrorist Police Organization, received a call on his private cell phone at a little after 2 a.m., Redmond informed him. Colonel H.A. Covington Frierson, are you willing to swear that you were in the same room with Trudy Griner at 2 in the morning? You understand the implications, sir? Yes, I do, replied Frierson, appalled. I never knew that you had an actual time on the call that the informant made to Zog. Trudy's phone wasn't even working, and even if it had been, she didn't have it in her possession. Ed M.C. Canless had them stashed away somewhere, damned if I can recall where. She couldn't have made that call. An interesting question, Colonel, said Nell. Why did no one in any of the previous investigations ever notice the fact that Volunteer Griner had something of an alibi for the 2 a.m. time period? As I recall from going over all those old files, the CO of the investigation did in fact notice that discrepancy but discounted it, returned Redmond. He figured that Trudy might have had another cell phone hidden on her person. Or she might have been wearing a wire connected to someone who was listening and who made the call to Coleman. That is at least a feasible possibility, of course. Mr. Frierson, this is important. She didn't leave the room at any time? To go to the can, to get a cup of coffee or a beer, anything? I know it's been more than 30 years, but try to remember. The fact is that thus far, you're the only person we've talked to thus far who was with Trudy Griner during that brief window of time. We'll be talking with Dr. Cord, of course, but we want to get everything we can from you first. I'm damned if I can remember every single minute, second by second, said Frierson with a helpless shrug and wave of his hand. I'm sorry. It's possible she might have done something to communicate with the outside, but I am damned if I can see how. If she was wired or bugged in any way, it must have been something so sophisticated that it contained no metal and didn't utilize any electric or electronic impulses at all, or our body scan would have picked it up. If there had been any suspicion at all, we would have strip-searched the suspected person, by force if necessary, and that includes everyone up to Murdoch himself. Gathered together like that we were vulnerable, we knew it, and we took no chances. Very well. Moving on, sir. Can you tell us what happened that morning? I understand that you and Bill Vitale were in the green pickup truck that served as the column's scout vehicle during the movement towards Port Orchard. I know Bill personally and he once described to me what happened, but I'd like to hear your version of it. We were on that county road just north of Shelton, and we were somewhat ahead of the column because we were coming up to the point where we were to cross over Highway 101, recounted Frierson. If there were any obvious enemy movements or anything else suspicious, Bill and I wanted to give the rest of them as much lead warning as we could. We rode right through the ambush position and we saw nothing. The Fatpos weren't total slouches, and given time they knew how to use camouflage and dig scrapes. All of a sudden we heard the firing from behind us and pulled over. Bill and I both understood what was happening, instantly. We got out of the truck, took our rifles and headed back on foot to reconnoiter, but it was obvious from the magnitude of the fire that something major was going down. More by accident than anything else, we ran into a couple of Fatpos. I think they were actually fleeing the scene. We shot and killed them both. We had no field glasses or anything, but it simply became obvious that there was nothing we could do. There were so many round strikes on the hillside just out of our view that they were raising a cloud of dust. With great difficulty I persuaded Bill to go back to the truck and E the area in accordance with General Order Number 8. You drove right through the Ravenhill ambush site and you saw nothing? Neither I nor volunteer William Vitali saw anything at all, said Frierson tersely. In short, Colonel, we both failed to do our jobs. I would have given up my life willingly then, and I would do so now if it would change that, but that is not possible. What happened, happened. We failed, and so the responsibility for what happened to the column lies largely with us, or more specifically with me, since I was the senior volunteer. Mr. Frierson, we have spoken with Arthur M.C. Bride, a former FATPO officer who took part in the ambush at Ravenhill on the enemy side, but who defected to the NVA soon after. He tells us that H. Covington, the Negroid FATPO commander Coleman, was aware that a green Dodge pickup truck would be used as a scout vehicle, and that he ordered his men lying in the ambush not to fire at you and let you pass. Were you aware of that? I was, said Frierson. I believe that all came out at the formal court of inquiry after the Revolution, the same one that sentenced Gertrude Greiner to death in absentia. Who knew the exact vehicle that you and Vital would be driving? I'm not sure. I probably mentioned that the vehicle was a pickup truck at some point when I was in the conference, but I honestly can't recall if I mentioned the make or the color. I don't think so. I would have had no reason to do so. Redmond sighed. Mr. Frierson, as you are a National Socialist, I know that you take a balanced view of the religious issues which I regret to say have plagued our country since its inception. But are you aware of the fact that Tom Murdoch was apparently a follower of the Norse gods, while Melanie Young, according to all historical record, was a devout Christian fundamentalist, what used to be known back in those days as a Jesus freak? Yes. I once went so far as to ask Mel about it, just out of pure curiosity. She said that God's gifts sometimes come in unlikely packages. The simple fact was that from the moment they set eyes on each other, they were completely head over heels in love, which was both a beautiful and a terrible thing for us to watch, considering where we were and what was happening all around us. Was Trudy Greiner jealous? Asked Redmond. She was hurt, said Frierson with deliberation. I could tell that. And yes, the thought has crossed my mind down through the years that she might have been so badly hurt that she lost all sense of proportion and lashed out, but in such a terrible and evil way. I just can't buy that. I never did, despite the findings of the tribunal. She was as solid for the revolution in her own quiet way as Melanie was in her passionate and turbulent way. I believed at the time that she accepted the situation philosophically and with dignity. The story of that $1 million has always been what totally baffles me about that whole sorry mess. Damn it, I just can't see her. It just doesn't feel right. Trudy Greiner left the safe house at Hoodsport at 3, said Redmond moodily, as the air car winged its way back to Olympia, an hour or so later. At 7 o'clock she's AWOL from her post at the aid station in Polsbo. What happened with her in those 4 hours? That has to be the key. I just remembered something, said Nell. You never did tell me. Just who was the original commanding officer of the tribunal that investigated Ravenhill?
Commandant John Corbett Morgan, said Redmond tonelessly. He didn't tell me that either. I had to learn it from the files. Nell said nothing for the rest of the flight. There seemed to be nothing to say. The next morning, Nell and Redmond drove down to Centralia, 300 feet above the old Interstate 5. Is Cord as weirded out as everyone says he is? Asked the Afrikaner sergeant. He can be difficult and abrupt, Redmond said carefully. You might say that he's kind of the last of the Gubus. Gubu. Grotesque, unbelievable, bizarre, and unprecedented. It's a slang term the old man picked up somewhere on his travels. He started using it in his writings about the 20th century racial resistance movement, and it stuck. Cord is of a certain anachronistic type the movement mostly weeded out in the early part of the century, or who were more accurately weeded out by Zog when they did stupid things and were arrested. Eccentrics, misfits, sad sacks, dysfunctionals, or barely functionals who came to the cause looking for an intellectual night's lodging, or simply a night's lodging of any kind. Cord is what might be politely called a rugged individualist, and not so politely called an asshole. He is arrogant and conceited.
He has an extremely abrasive personality, and he has great difficulty getting along with people. The other side of that coin is that he is what's called a polymath, a genius in multiple fields, and he has always placed those talents at the service of the party and the Republic. I think Palmieri hit it right on the head. Throughout his H. A. Covington entire life, Cord has manifested an incredible ability to make himself absolutely indispensable to the revolution, to the point where the rest of us have learned to grit our teeth and put up with him. This should be interesting. Even with their Bureau of State Security credentials, it took them almost half an hour to get through the extensive SS security into the main block of the Northwest Space Center. The facility itself was the size of a small town, neatly laid out, row after row of buildings and hangars and warehouses. The streets were labeled by specialty: Cybernetic Street, Telemetry Avenue, Propulsion Square, Plasma Place, Mars Boulevard, Luna Lane, Aerodynamics Avenue, etc. To the east stretched the great tarmac expanse of the spaceport itself, dotted with great gantries rearing skyward, scooters and trucks, and service vehicles swarming back and forth like beetles. 2 shuttlecraft on the launching pads were fueling from massive rolling tankers the size of Don's house. The entire base was ringed with banks of plasma ray anti-aircraft weapons, equipped with the latest computerized firing systems and the most highly trained battery crews in the Republic. Any attempt to hit the spaceport from the air or from space itself would draw a devastating counterfire. They found Dr. Joseph Cord in his office, leaning back in his rolling chair behind his desk and contemplating a computer display plate that filled one wall of the room. The famous scientist was scowling intently at a weird congeries of geometric forms that seemed to be doing some kind of mating dance. Occasionally he diddled with a remote mouse, and the dance seemed to change directions. Redmond had no idea what the gyrating rhomboids and tetrahedrons meant. Cord was a tall and stoop-shouldered man in his 70s wearing a dusty white lab coat. A shock of unruly white hair fell down into his eyes as he peered into the computer screen. His heavy-featured face was smooth-shaven, but his sunken cheeks and chin were white-stubbled. Laser surgery to correct defects of vision was now a standard procedure in the Northwest Republic, in most cases being performed in childhood as soon as the problem was diagnosed. But nonetheless, Cord still affected a large pair of thick, horn-rimmed spectacles. In a country where corrective lenses were now completely unknown, this was definitely on the high side of eccentric. Eyeglasses were more antique than the fad for waxed mustaches. As they walked in, Cord looked up and stared at the 2 policemen through his bottle-lensed glasses. He had an odd facial tic, and behind the lenses his pale green eyes seemed to roll like those of a child's doll, although possibly that was an optical illusion. "Dr. Cord, I am Colonel Donald Redmond, and this is Sergeant Hendrik Nell, from the Bureau of State Security." "Yes, I know who you are," said Cord abruptly, his voice a low, hollow, booming sound. "My secretary gave me your message, which I had neither the time nor the inclination to answer. I have nothing to do with security matters. Not my department. What do you want?" "The truth about what happened at Ravenhill Ranch," replied Don. Cord took off his glasses. Without them his baleful glare was even more unnerving.
"And what on earth makes you think I can tell you that?"
he boomed. "Speak up, young man. You look like you need a dose of ipecac." It had been a long time since anyone had called Don young man. "Well, now that you put it to me that way, I realize you probably can't tell me after all," admitted Redmond with a casual shrug. "I doubt if you know much of anything I can't get somewhere else. Do not patronize me, and do not attempt to use reverse psychology on me, young man. You aren't very good at it, and I am in any case immune to mind games, since my mind is infinitely superior to anyone who might attempt to play them. I am as close to omniscient as any human being in history has ever become," rumbled Cord. He wasn't even indignant. He was simply stating a fact that was entirely obvious to him. "I have spent my entire life filling my mind with anything and everything worth knowing, and as a result I can tell you pretty much what you want to know about anything at all. If I am so disposed, and if you have the intellect to understand my response." "That is an impressive talent to possess, sir," said Redmond dryly. "Omniscience can be a handy facility for a policeman. I may be consulting you more often in the future. But in the matter of Ravenhill Ranch, I believe you have a part of the truth, even though you may not know it. I want to discover your piece of the puzzle, so that I can eventually fit them all together. H.A. Covington. How very scientific of you, sneered Cord. That was very long ago, and I haven't thought of that episode for many years.
Why now?
Because Trudy Griner is coming home. She says she is innocent, said Redmond. No woman is innocent, grunted Cord. Since the time of Eve, women have been vessels of iniquity. Original sin, gentlemen, original sin. The curse of God is upon all womankind, clearly stated in the scriptures. One of the reasons I never married one, in spite of our government's fecund social policy. Is that why not? Probably best for all concerned, agreed Don politely. Personally, I have always favored reproduction of the species through artificial insemination, based on a strict eugenic program. I am of course willing to donate my own superior genetic material for such an endeavor. How very scientific of you, sir. Not to mention patriotic. Redmond and Nell seated themselves on the sofa that stood against one wall of the office. I did not ask you to sit down, said Cord with a scowl. I didn't ask your permission, said Redmond. We're boss. We sit where we like and we shit where we like. Dr. Cord, since your time is obviously valuable, I will get right to the point. It is my understanding that as part of the troop dispositions for the mortar attack on the Special Criminal Court in Port Orchard, you were assigned to set up a temporary aid station in Polesbow, in anticipation of possible casualties from the action.
May I ask if this was a regular division of labor in the column?
Yes. I worked my way through my junior and senior years at UCLA as a part-time paramedic, or EMT as they were called in those days, said Cord. I was never particularly interested in medicine, but it is a branch of biology, and biology does have a number of scientific applications. And as an EMT, I could also gain access to live specimens for experimentation in such fields, as bacteriology, organic chemistry, and so on. The fact was that I was the closest thing to a doctor the column had. I was at the aid station, a Burger Boy restaurant just outside Polesbow that was run on a franchise by a party sympathizer. A Burger Boy? Asked Redmond. Wasn't that a rather public and exposed position? Urban camouflage, explained Cord impatiently. Very basic stuff. Surely you were in the military yourself. Surely they give you some kind of training in your organization. I shouldn't have to tell you these things.
Hide in plain sight, Colonel.
We discovered through experience that a semi-public position for such facilities was actually better than some obscure little house in the country, where unusual traffic in and out might be detectable by aerial and satellite surveillance. The satellites would not see anything out of the ordinary in many cars coming and going outside a fast food restaurant, only typical Americans and their grossly overweight offspring pulling in to tank up on cholesterol, starch, and salt. We always set up a medic station before any major action, not only for medical purposes but for redirection if things went badly. If any of our men were wounded and could escape and evade, they tried to make it to the aid station, and I did what I could to help them. Sometimes I could save their lives, sometimes they ended up buried in shallow graves nearby. On the morning of August 1st, I had set up a crude operating theater in the storeroom, as sterile as I could get it using disinfectant and disposable sanitary wipes, along with as many units of plasma and whole blood as we had been able to steal from various hospitals and blood banks. I was required to know all our people's blood types, of course, and I recall I had to retype every pint of whole blood we obtained, because the Third World medical personnel in the American hospitals and the Red Cross were so stunningly incompetent. Sometimes as much as 20% of the blood was mistyped. Volunteer David Leach was with me for security. He was a rather violent and uncouth young man, not to mention a blasphemer and a sinner who was headed straight for hell and no doubt still is unless he wakes up in time to accept Jesus Christ as his personal savior. But he was very good with a gun. He was my bodyguard. I was considered to be the most important member of the column, and Mr. Leach was my escort to make sure I could get my job done. Miss Gertrude Griner was supposed to join me there. She was a damned fine nurse, and truth to tell, she was as good a paramedic as I was. One of the few women on earth I've ever had any time for. But she never showed up. H. Covington. What time was she supposed to report to the aid station? Asked Redmond. 0700 hours. When she was half an hour late, Leach began trying to contact Commandant Murdoch on a pager with a special coded warning number. meaning that something might be wrong and to proceed with caution. When she still hadn't showed by 8 o'clock, Leach tried calling on a series of cell phone numbers belonging to Murdoch, Melanie Young, and others. He got no answer from any of them. We now know why, of course. Cord hesitated. The memory of those grim, eerie unanswered calls was apparently powerful enough to penetrate even his self-absorption. About 8:30 that morning we saw news of the ambush on CNN. I immediately broke everything down, and Mr. Leach and I evacuated the area to our respective E&E stations. In my case, it was a dirty trailer behind a Jiffy Lube in Tacoma. And do you know what volunteer Leach's E&E station was? Asked Redmond. No, of course not, replied Cord irritably. That was a standard security precaution. Everyone in the unit had such a place of refuge in case things went bad, but we never told one another where our E&Es were, specifically to frustrate informers. You wear the ribbon, Colonel. You must know this. What was your bolt hole? I had two, a short-range hideout in the janitor's office at Sammamish High School, and a long-term regroup point in North Bend. Dr. Cord, we have come to believe that the secret to unraveling the answer to what happened at Ravenhill lies in something that took place during the conference at the Hood Sports Safe House, during the night and the early hours of the morning, which immediately preceded the ambush. We understand that Trudy Greiner left the safe house at approximately 3 o'clock in the morning, and that she did so in her own car. Does that fit in with your recollection? Yes, I believe so. A white Nissan, I believe. We understand that she was supposed to arrive at the medical aid station driving a van which had been converted into an impromptu ambulance for use if needed. Is that right? Continued Redmond. Yes, replied Cord. We are therefore working on the assumption that when she left the safe house she was headed to someplace else to collect that van. Do you know where? I believe you are correct, Colonel. Where was the van? That I couldn't tell you for certain. I do recall that Commandant Murdoch and Miss Greiner had a conversation off in one corner of a few minutes' duration. I assume he gave her his instructions then. You don't know if the van was parked or stashed somewhere, or if it was delivered to her anywhere, by another driver perhaps. Ah, I understand, said Cord. You are trying to deduce the possible presence of an as yet unknown party in the affair who might have been involved in the betrayal of the column. Very clever. Redmond was slightly unsettled by the quickness with which Cord picked up on his line of reasoning. The man was no fool, however unpleasant he came across. The answer is, I didn't know. Nor did I ask. We operated on a strict need-to-know basis, and I didn't need to know that particular detail. All I needed to know was that the medevac vehicle would be there at the Burger Boy if we needed it. Yes, it is possible she was meeting someone to pick up the van directly. In fact, I think it probable. Why is that, sir? Asked Redmond. She would need a very secure place to park her own private car. One where there was no risk it would be found, said Cord. To the NVA during the Revolution, Colonel, vehicles were almost as precious a commodity as guns and ammunition. It was very much like living in the old Wild West, where one's life depended in equal measure on one's gun and one's horse, and we learned to keep both very close. We never liked to park our cars and be separated from our transport for any length of time. Never knew when we might need to make a fast break. Instead of parking our vehicle in some remote spot and hoping it wouldn't be found by the police, or towed away, or stripped by third-world thieves, we always liked to do a handover to another volunteer when it was necessary to change into something more suitable for the job at hand. Then we'd arrange for pickup or to trade cars again afterwards. It didn't always work out that way, of course. Sometimes we had no choice but to stash a car for a while, but we preferred not to, and so that's why I think it is not only a Covington, possible but somewhat likely that Miss Greiner was supposed to hand over her Nissan to someone else in exchange for the van. I see your point, sir, said Redmond, rubbing his chin. Oh, hell, he thought. Let's get it over with and hope the tirade isn't so bad. Dr. Cord, as reluctant as I am to introduce a religious aspect into this inquiry, are you aware of the fact that Commandant Thomas Murdoch was apparently a follower of the old gods of the Norse mythology, whereas Melanie Young was a fundamentalist Christian? Murdoch was a pagan? Scoffed Cord skeptically. I don't believe it. Surely he would have said something to me about it. Ah, well, perhaps it's just a rumor, said Redmond in some relief. Unfortunately, I believe the well-known liaison between Murdoch and Volunteer Young was not mere rumor. We have become very interested in the personal relationship between Commandant Murdoch, Volunteer Greiner, and Volunteer Young. Specifically, we understand that Murdoch had been personally involved with Trudy Greiner up until the time that Melanie Young arrived from Montana to take up her assignment with the Olympic flying column. Murdoch then allegedly broke things off with Trudy and took up with Melanie. This romantic triangle aspect has been suggested to us as a possible motive for Volunteer Grainer's betrayal of the column. What are your thoughts and observations on that? Cord scowled. I am ashamed to admit that entirely too often our racial liberation movement was a revolting hotbed of unbridled lust. Seize, what a recruiting incentive, whispered Nell sotto voce. Redmond shushed him, but Cord rambled on, oblivious. Yes, I was aware that Murdoch and Miss Young were committing the sin of carnality in the unmarried state, and before that the Commandant was doing the same thing with Miss Greiner. I'm sorry to say that sort of thing was quite common, and one simply had to learn to look the other way in order to be effective. I was especially disappointed in Miss Young's wanton behavior, since she claimed to be a religious person. I attempted to speak to her about it on several occasions, but for some reason she seemed disinclined to discuss it with me. Indeed, said Redmond, his eyebrows arching. One does wonder why. I can only conclude that she retained at least some sense of shame regarding her carnal sin, replied Cord pompously. I hope that remedial diffidence has been sufficient to spare her some of the subsequent punishment she has endured in hell since her death in such a state of impurity. Nell opened his mouth to say something, but Redmond caught his eye and shook his head. As to that motivating Miss Greiner to do what she did, who knows why a woman does anything? They are ruled by their emotions and not by reason like men are. Or most men anyway. But I should have thought that the $1 million she was paid would also have formed some part of her motivation. All of a sudden there was a buzz on the intercom on Cord's desk. Dr. Cord? I'm sorry to disturb you, sir, but it looks like we're coming down to the kill on that Omni 12 on orbital track 733, the young man on the other end told him. You're sure? Asked Cord excitedly. Affirmative, sir. The bogey is over Indonesia now and we've got Falcon 4 closing on him, said the voice on the intercom. The target will be within termination range in about 9 minutes. I think you'd better come down to the control room. I'm sorry, Colonel, but duty calls, said Cord, rising with alacrity. The prospect of imminent technology seemed to alter and revitalize him. Want a ringside seat for one of the battles in the first war fought in space? Wouldn't miss it for the world, said Redmond. Despite Cord's irritating arrogance, Don was genuinely fascinated by anything to do with space and eager to learn more. They took a long elevator ride down to the control room. The Falcon Program Satellite Command Center was in a huge cavernous chamber deep in the bowels of the Earth, carpeted in air, conditioned and capable of surviving a direct hit with up to a 40-megaton nuclear warhead, as Cord informed them proudly. The whole forward wall of the long room now showed the blue curvature of the Earth, filling the lower left-hand third of the giant screen. A small light blinked among the stars above the inverted blue bowl at about 2 o'clock. Cord took them into a glassed-in booth that contained several banks of screens and instruments. The scientist seated himself in front, H. Covington, of a control panel and began flicking switches and pressing buttons. He assumed a professorial and somewhat condescending tone. What you are seeing, gentlemen, is a fighter's eye view of war in space. This telemetry is coming from one of our unmanned Falcon orbital interception modules. That's our target, said Cord intently, pointing at the blinking light. In this view, we are filtering out all the assorted space junk surrounding the target so we can concentrate on it, although if something gets in the way, it will appear on the screen. We have been pursuing an American spy satellite, an Omni 12, launched in July from Canaveral. One of their newest and most sophisticated, Chinese technology and Korean manufacture. The Americans seem incapable of actually building anything advanced for themselves anymore. It is run by an artificial intelligence chip designed by Dr. Saul Bloomberg of MIT, a gentleman of Hebraic heritage who is one of our worst enemies. Dr. Bloomberg has openly dedicated his life to erasing the Northwest Republic from the face of the earth, as he blames us for the loss of his precious goddamned Israel. Blames us with some reason, I am happy to say, said Redmond with a proud snarl. Indeed, you might say he is my opposite number. Bloomy and I spend our lives destroying one another's work. He creates avionic polymers and amalgams he thinks to be plasma-proof. The Americans build aircraft, and I create new plasma synergies to break through whatever they've come up with. That's what I was doing when you interrupted me just now. Bloomy thinks his Compound 19 will restore American air supremacy so they can slaughter us all from the sky with impunity like we were so many Arabs. We will see how well Compound 19 holds up against my green magic ray. I think he and a few hapless American pilots are in for a surprise. Bloomberg doesn't play fair, though. The little kike has tried to have me assassinated twice. By the by, Colonel, next time you see Mr. Randall, please thank him again for saving my life on that second occasion. That American idiot with his grenade destroyed one of my computer drives, and I lost some data. It was very annoying. I will, Doctor, promised Redmond. 2 times? I'm impressed. I've only rated 3 attempts myself. Now, sir, let's not get boastful, exe, warned Nel sotto voce. I don't think he likes the idea of being outdone in anything by a mere copper. By the way, when do we ask him about how he got into the NVA in the old days? Do you really want to sit through that? Don whispered back. Point taken, sir. Egotist though he was, Cord was too involved with his instruments and the screen to take umbrage at Redmond being one up on him in the assassination attempt department. We've been tracking that ugly bird for weeks, trying to get one of our Falcons within range, Cord told them. It's quite a game, since neither of the craft has a milligram of fuel to waste, and every maneuver must be calculated to the last micron. Rather than waste time in all this Hannah and dancing about, why not hunt these spy satellites down and pick them off with plasma weapons from a manned craft? Asked Nell. Because they've started arming these little guys with counter-weapons that might hull one of our vessels and get some of our astronauts killed, said Cord. The state president has decided that's an escalation we want to avoid. The problem is it's entirely too easy to get killed in space, and there would eventually be fatalities. If they kill any of our space crews, we'll have to retaliate by taking out some of theirs. You know the iron rule, no one lays a hand on any of our Republic's people, anywhere, anytime. We just got a reminder of that from talking to Bloody Dave Leach, said Redmond. Yes, David practices what he preaches, as you know. As the good burghers of Wellington, New Zealand found out. And to think I knew him when he was a mere homicidal maniac. So far, the shooting part of the space war is only between unmanned robot vehicles, and apparently Zog is willing to keep it that way. For now, good, said Redmond with a sigh of relief. My son Alan is at Landfall Station on Mars. He's coming home soon, and I want to be sure his shuttle has a nice quiet re-entry. Luftwaffe Captain Alan Redmond? Asked Cord. Why, yes, I believe I remember him. He was on several of my training courses in astronavigation and spatial engineering. Very bright young man. So what's happening now? Asked Nell H. Covington. Intercepting a satellite in orbit when it is trying to evade you isn't an easy thing to do by remote telemetry, gentlemen, said Cord. You have all kinds of variables of gravity, trajectory, inertia, orbital centrifugal force, acceleration and deceleration to take into consideration. All that can get even more complicated when the target is equipped with various devices to escape and confuse pursuit, like this one is. What kind of devices? Asked Nell curiously. Radar scrambling and distortion equipment making it impossible for us to lock onto it. Helium balloons made of thin metal envelopes that surround the vehicle. Create false images and serve as decoys, said Cord, studying the screen and the instruments intently. But they've now got a new wrinkle. That ugly bird can squirt a sort of smokescreen of silver nitrate particles that effectively blinds our radar for several minutes, almost like an octopus in the sea squirting ink to blind and confuse a predator while it escapes. Under cover of the silver nitrate cloud, the Omni shifts direction a few degrees and assumes a whole new orbit, which we then have to plot out. Then we have to fire Falcon 4's retros in a controlled burn to resume an intercept path and bring it within range of the Falcon's plasma gun and laser. From the enemy's point of view, the name of the game is for the target satellite to make like a jackrabbit, try to run us to death, exhaust our tracker's fuel, thus losing it until we can get a manned shuttle to pick the Falcon up from orbit and refuel it, then relaunch it. But this bird hasn't done that for a while now. We think he's out of smoke. Now we're close enough to try and nail him, but he is most likely also equipped with detectors that sense particle beam fire and set off a small gas-powered gyroscope that gives the satellite a short jerk or shift up or down, right or left. Sometimes only an inch too, not enough actually to alter the orbit, but enough to avoid a particle beam that's only a few millimeters wide. That satellite can literally dodge bullets, Colonel, and I don't feel like wasting the Falcon's plasma charges on it. Falcon has a laser as well, but I'd have to get a wee bit closer than I'd like to try and use it. It would be close enough so debris and shock from the explosion of the Omni might damage our own bird, not to mention any counterweapons they might use. The laser beam is only a pin's width, and it's possible we might not disable or destroy the enemy while depleting our own vehicle's power. Resources. We'll save the beams for taking out less athletic targets. Plus, our own bird may need that juice to defend itself against an American interceptor later.
So what will you do?
Asked Nell. Torpedo the bastard, replied Cord. Eh? Exclaimed Nell. Falcon 4 is also equipped with 8 solid-fuel rocket torpedoes, 2 meters in length, each with a 10-kilogram warhead of plastic explosive, wrapped with steel bands, which will provide a wide spread of shrapnel. Even if we don't get a direct hit, detonate the warhead close enough, and a blast of several thousand hot metal shards the size of birdshot going through the skin of that ugly bird should take it out of action, render it just so much dead flying junk. But let's go for a direct hit, shall we? I feel like seeing something vaporized, and I want Bloomy to see a nice big explosion. Eh? Asked Redmond. Right now Bloomberg is sitting in Canaveral behind the controls of that Omni, just as I am here. I can sense his presence. Good. I'm going to break his toy. Cord spoke into a microphone. Ready torpedoes 1 and 2. Aye, aye, Herr Oberst, came a voice on the intercom. Cord looked up and grinned like a little boy. I like to imagine I'm a U-boat captain in the North Atlantic, part of a wolf pack zeroing in on an American convoy. Or maybe Walter Schweiger lining the Lusitania up in my sights during the First War. On these occasions, my staff is kind enough to oblige me. He turned back to his controls and monitors. Does he still play with boats in the bathtub, I wonder? Wondered Nell in a whisper. He's a bit hard to take, that I grant you, whispered Redmond. But this is all very real, and damn it all, as much as he pisses me off, I have to admit that if there's any one man the Republic owes its existence to, it's Cord. Not even the old man. The old man gave us an idea, but Cord was the one who brought down the bombers. Napoleon once said that revolution is an idea that has found bayonets. The old man gave us the idea. Cord gave us the bayonets. Torpedoes ready, Dr. Cord, a scientist in a lab coat several chairs away said, staring into his own console. H. A. Covington. Fire 1 and 2, shouted Cord gleefully. 2 spinning, glowing spots of fire seemed to whirl silently away from just below the camera's range and out over the brilliant, curving blue and white cloud fleece of the Earth. Redmond would have thought they would head directly for the light of the target satellite, but they seemed actually to be spiraling down towards the Earth. Then the lights blinked out, and for almost a minute there was silence, except for low electronic bleeps and pings from the equipment. Ugly's firing retros, sir, said one of the console people. A woman. He sees the torpedoes and he's taking evasive action. 1 and 2 auto-correcting. Redmond could not detect any motion at all in the light of the American satellite on the screen. Then all of a sudden it seemed to flicker. Damn, said another one of the men in white lab coats. Silver nitrate cloud, Dr. Cord. Looks like they weren't out after all. Radar's real patchy, can't get a solid fix. Torpedoes 28.4 miles in closing. Give me manual, commanded Cord. I'll try and bracket him. Cord coolly and swiftly moved levers, pushed buttons, and rode a small joystick. There were several brief dual bursts, pinpoints of light on the screen, as the Nahr rocket torpedoes fired and changed course. I need to get those 2 torpedoes on either side of Ugly Bird and blow them simultaneously, he muttered by way of explanation. Like swatting a fly by clapping your 2 hands together. Now, is Bloomberg dropping the orbit or raising it? Aryans are spiritual beings, and our minds naturally rise to the heavens. Jews are materialists, and in a crunch, they automatically gravitate towards the Earth. Bloomberg is going down. In every sense of the term. Redmond and Nell stared at one another. A woman scientist in a lab coat leaned over. Metaphysical astrogation, she whispered. He does that all the time. He sometimes calculates interplanetary range and distance in biblical cubits. The hell of it is, more often than not, he's right. He's probably right this time. Suddenly, Cord touched a button, and there were 2 twin blasts on the screen, like the popping of 2 flashbulbs. A moment after that, there was a gigantic blaze of blue-white light that blotted out the huge screen. It was almost 5 seconds before the Earth appeared again, and this time the blackness above the glowing bowl of Terra was empty except for the stars. A wild cheer arose from the dozen or so people behind the consoles in the control room, and several of them stepped forward to shake Cord's hand and pound him on the back in joy. "One of those was a direct hit, sir," yelled one of the technicians. "Congratulations, Dr. Cord," said Redmond in genuine admiration. Cord grinned at him. "I have been up on the shuttles and the space stations over 24 times," he told the two boss men. "Saul Bloomberg has never left the Earth. Now you know why. One day I hope to meet him in space." We keep getting back to that crucial 4 hours between 3 and 7 in the morning. "Now we have another question to answer," said Redmond, as they were leaving the Space Center. "And that is?" asked Nell. "Who, if anyone, was Trudy Griner meeting to deliver the ambulance van? Why exactly didn't Trudy Griner show up at the aid station to help with the wounded like she was supposed to? Was the van not where it was supposed to be? Joseph Cord's statement backs up Leach's. Trudy was supposed to be at the Burger Boy in Polsbo at 7 in the morning sharp. Why wasn't she there?" "Because she knew what was going to happen," suggested Nell. "Because she really was the traitor and she was busy collecting her $1 million reward." "Sir, nothing we have uncovered thus far in any way indicates to me that the Griner woman was not the informant, just as history tells us she was supposed to be there at 7 in the morning. She wasn't there. That means something serious," asserted Redmond. "Punctuality was a survival skill in those days. You were never late, the only acceptable excuses being death or arrest. The survival of the whole unit, and beyond that the fate of our whole people, depended on a volunteer being wherever he or she said they'd be, exactly when they said they'd be. So what delayed her? Was it guilty knowledge? But even if she was the traitor, why draw immediate suspicion to herself? She could have shown up at the aid station, and once the disaster became known, she could have gotten away on the pretext that she was going to her first E&E point like Leach and Cord did. No, I have a gut feeling that for some reason Trudy Griner ran into trouble after she left the Hoodsport safe house. H. Covington." "What kind of trouble?" asked Nell. "Trouble from whoever was delivering that medevac van to her. There's someone else involved in this, someone whose name we don't yet know." The Ancient Days bookshop stood gabled and awninged at the corner of Main and Tower Streets in the middle of Centralia's meticulously restored historic district of mellow red brick and brick-cobbled streets. It was a large, comfortable place, redolent with mellow incense, fine carpet, and the delightful smell all true bibliophiles crave, that only comes from generously stocked shelves of books. The walls were lined with row after row of volumes on ancient Celtic and Nordic religions, Wicca, magic and paranormal subjects, tarot and astrology. The center spaces of the shop contained glass display cases and tables of jewelry, ritual objects used in the practice of the old religious ceremonies, and other knickknacks. Sticks of fragrant jasmine and sandalwood smoked in discreet joss burners in various corners, and a log fire crackled in a brass Franklin stove against one wall. "We admit, we try for a 1960s ambiance," Brittany M.C. Canlis told them. "Yes, granted it was a degenerate period in most ways, but there was a beginning of an occult racial awakening among the folk. True spiritual enlightenment eventually leads down the path of nature, and nature leads directly to the truth of blood." "Hell, you might as well," chuckled Don. "Half our population dresses from the 1930s and the other half from the 1890s. And a few old eccentrics like Lars Frierson go for the 1970s look. One of our freedoms in the NAR seems to be the freedom to pick whatever era of the past you're most comfortable in. And why not? America forced an ugly and unwanted future on the folk, so why should we now not be able to choose a more beautiful and desirable past in some respects, if that is what we wish?" asked Brittany with a smile. She was a slim and graceful woman with long iron-gray hair done in a single long braid down her back. She had to be well into her 60s at least, but she looked at least 20 years younger. She was wearing a long woolen gown with embroidered full sleeves. Her husband, Ed M.C. Canlis, was dressed in a more modern tweed jacket with a western string tie. He sported a neatly trimmed white imperial beard. They both wore the green, white, and blue ribbon of the War of Independence, Ed on his lapel and Brittany on her bodice. Beside those were the small red, black and white everyday wear rondels of the Iron Cross, earned on the day they had driven the mortar truck into the Federal Special Criminal Court in Port Orchard. Don had read the official reports. He had seen the old photographs of them taken by the enemy. He could almost close his eyes and see this elderly couple in those days, he tall and strong like some gallows glass of old Ulster, she a magnificent Valkyrie, with long hair flying in the wind of battle. Don could almost see and hear the guns blazing in their hands as they covered Saltovic and Palmieri, while they rammed the truck into the courthouse, set the detonator, and ran for the battered Oldsmobile. 4 of them, thought Don in utter shame and despair. 10-1. After all their brothers and sisters were slaughtered, the 4 of them went into that town and fought 40 of those yellow cur dogs who served red, white, and blue America. Gun to gun, hand to hand, and now I come into their home to question them, to bring into doubt the whole fabric of their lives. Dear God, how dare I? Who the hell am I to so much as bend my head in their direction? The 4 of them sat in a small living room off the main shop floor, and Brittany poured them chamomile tea from a large, freshly brewed brown clay pot. There was also a plate of highly tasty cookies made of organic brown wheat flour and honey. Nell held his teacup and saucer delicately in his hand, somewhat put off by the outre and mystical surroundings. Clearly, you're basic fish and chips man, thought Redmond in amusement. It's always good to have an old comrade stop by, Colonel, said Brittany, even if it is on official business. Tell me, does another of your old comrades ever stop by? Asked Redmond. I refer to Dr. Joseph Cord from the Space Center. Seeing as how he's in the area, surely he must drop by occasionally to hash over old times, not to mention this superb chamomile. I'm sure Sarah's is just as good, said Brittany. Well, yes, admitted Redmond. I'm sure she'd want me to say hello by the by. Does Dr. Cord ever drop in? He persisted. Holy Joe? Not likely, replied Ed dryly. As far as Joe Cord is concerned, we are Satan's emissaries on earth. We haven't spoken. H. A. Covington. In years. Every now and then we see him on the sidewalk here in Centralia. He crosses the street to avoid us. I'm sorry to hear that, said Redmond, shaking his head. Religious differences aside, that is not the way to treat former comrades from the volunteers. That's just Joe, said MC Canless with a shrug. He's always been a bit of an eccentric. He's always been a bit of an asshole, corrected Brittany with a sweet smile. Let's be fair to the man, Britt, sighed Ed. Joe was a loyal volunteer, and for an egghead he never lacked courage. Courage among white men was in rather short supply back then, and he should get credit for that. He's a brilliant scientist, and his plasma weapons are the main reason we're all sitting here and we weren't bombed into craters by the United States Air Force. But yes, to be absolutely truthful, he's also an insufferable asshole. Anybody who knows him can tell you that. It's customary to make allowances for genius, I know, but in Joe's case one has to make a lot of allowances. Did Dr. Cord feel the same way about you during the War of Independence? Asked Redmond carefully. Not just you personally, I mean, did he seem to have issued with comrades who followed the old gods, or who were atheists or agnostics? He was pretty much the same back then as he is now, yes, replied Brittany MC Canless. That's very sad in a way. One is supposed to use one's journey through life to grow in a spiritual sense, Colonel. Joe has spent his life accumulating a vast amount of knowledge of the universe without, and not a lot in the way of understanding the universe within. His is a very tragic karma when one thinks about it, but again, since this seems to be my day to play devil's advocate, we have to give the pompous ass his due, put in Ed MC Canless. He did his duty well then as now, and as much as we disliked him even then, we knew that when the chips were down he would have been there for us, as we would have been there for him. As it turns out, that situation occurred on more than one occasion. Joe saved both our lives once, for which we will always be grateful, and we saved his life once, which I am sure embarrasses and bothers the hell out of him to this day. You folks get much trouble from the Holy Ghost crowd these days? Asked Redmond. Mostly just empty threats, said Brittany. We ignored them. Once our eldest boy Siegfried caught one of our local Bible punchers spray painting, "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live," on the side of the store. Sieg was on leave from the SS, and he just completed a hand-to-hand course, and so he broke a few bones the man of God didn't need. The preacher man squawked for the civil guard. The cop came and saw what he'd been doing, and so the officer slapped him around some more before loading him into an ambulance. For some reason we haven't had any trouble to speak of since then. Every now and then one of them comes by waving tracts and tries to save our souls, said Ed. We invite them in for tea and spend a pleasant hour or so messing with their minds. But to be fair, when they see our War of Independence ribbons they usually calm down. Hellfire and brimstone aside, even the ones who think we're satanic respect that little bit of cloth. I'd also like to say that with the exception of Joe Cord, neither Britt nor I have ever gotten any disrespect from any of our Christian brothers and sisters in arms who went through that war with us. The few problems we get come from new immigrants or from woodchucks. We're both woodchucks ourselves, dear, his wife reminded him gently. Yes, I know, but you know what I mean. Darrell and his other brother, Darrell, asked Redmond. Who? Asked Nell, curiously. It's an old Northwest expression from migration times, explained Redmond. It means native-born Northwest country yokel types. I have no idea on earth where it originated. There is another one some of our settlers would use sometimes, DM, which means drooling moron. That is a mortal insult and is accepted by our courts as constituting fighting words, as you know, along with wigger. Not to mention being a disgraceful slur against any racial brother or sister against whom it is directed. It's not really the country yokels who give trouble so much as it is the descendants of the wealthier families who lived in the Northwest before the migration started, added MC Canless. You know there is still an undercurrent of resentment among those who, H. A. Covington, were part of the old ruling elite, the bankers and lawyers and such who made money under the United States regime, and who still resent being relegated to the status of mere white people. Yeah, we get some of that in Boss, agreed Redmond with a nod. Every now and then we crack an espionage or subversion case involving people who still hold a grudge from the American time, mostly older ones, who only remember all the luxury toys and crap their rich parents gave them as kids. That's pretty much dying out now. My kids are woodchucks themselves, and so are yours. Interestingly, those few cases of disloyalty among pre-revolutionary residents are more than counterbalanced by the thousands of people who fled from the Republic when we took over, and have since come back home, or their children who have returned. They have enough horror stories to tell about life in the wonderful United States to shut up the last of the disgruntled God bless America types. So, why did you want to see us, Colonel? Asked Ed anxiously. I hate to sound paranoid, but it's not about that asinine plot to murder Pastor Briggs, is it? We barely knew Mr. Andrews, although of course we have heard about his arrest, and those of the others. I promise you that we utterly condemn what he was planning, and we would have nothing to do with any violence against other white people, whatever their religious views, or violence against anybody. All that is over for us. Remember that rock song from the last century that goes, "Now you're old and gray, Fernando. It's many years since I have seen a rifle in your hand," said Brittany with a smile. That's Ed and me. I don't even know if we still have any guns around. We gave them all to our kids. I think Siegfried still carries my old Glock 9mm as a vehicle weapon. Well, that may not be completely true, demurred Ed. I think I've still got that old Ruger Mini 14 I toted during the war up in the attic somewhere, but it's an antique, probably rusted solid by now. Probably blow up in my face if I tried to fire it, even if I could find some ammunition for it. Anyway, when we did fight, it was to put a stop to just that kind of thing. Hatred between white people, like this Andrews business. Straight up, Colonel, we had nothing to do with that crap, and we wouldn't have anything to do with anything like that. MC Canless was clearly on the defensive. No, believe me, if your names had come up in relation to that case, you would have seen me here before this, and I wouldn't be sitting here drinking your tea, Redmond assured them. My reason for being here has to do with something in the past. I'm here to talk to you about the last days of the Olympic flying column. Ah, said Ed glumly. That was a very sad and terrible event in our lives, Colonel, said Brittany quietly. May I ask what possible interest state security could have in it today? I am interviewing all the survivors of the column, said Redmond. Why? Asked Ed bluntly. Usually a cop keeps as much information back as he can as leverage, but in this investigation I have made it a policy to be completely open with all of you as to the purpose of my question, said Redmond. The state president has received a communication from Trudy Griner, a communication that we believe to be authentic. She alleges that she is innocent of the charge of treason, and she is coming home on October 22nd. She is demanding a public trial on the charges against her. Trudy is coming home, gasped Brittany. She says she's innocent, and if she is, that means one of us has to be guilty, grated Ed harshly. Bluntly, yes, that's what it looks like, said Redmond. That can't be, said Brittany quietly. I'm sorry, sir, but you are wrong. That cannot possibly be. It must not be. I hope there's some way out of this particular maze, ma'am, replied Don. I am here to learn if that is possible. Sergeant Nell and I are conducting interviews with all of the survivors of the Olympic flying column, and we are taking a similar tack with all of you. The first thing I would like to know is some general background, how each of you became involved with the party and the NVA, and... There was a little tinkle from the bell over the shop door. I'll get it, said Ed, rising. Excuse me, Colonel. Of course, replied Don. Ed M.C. Canlis got up and went out onto the shop floor to deal with his customer. His wife Brittany leaned forward. H. Covington. I'm glad Ed is gone, Colonel, because I need to answer your question before he comes back, she said urgently, putting her hand on Don's wrist. Don remembered Palmieri's description of that same hand on his wrist over 30 years before in the Port Orchard diner as being like a vice grip. It was not like that now, but somehow just as strong and urgent. The whole topic upsets my husband and enrages him even to this day, and he is reaching an age where extreme emotional disturbance can cause him serious problems with his health. You asked how we became involved. I will tell you very quickly, and then when Ed comes back, please don't refer to it. Please. I understand, said Don with a nod. I grew up in Seattle, Brittany told them. My parents were yuppies. My mother worked all day at a high-powered white-collar job just like my father, and so for all practical purposes I had no parents. I was what was then known as a latchkey kid. My childhood was completely aimless. I had too much money, too little love, and too much time on my own. From there it was straight into the drugs. Booze at 12, marijuana at 13, ecstasy at 14, cocaine at 15, crack at 16, and heroin at 17. 17 was my bad year. To this very day I am astounded by the fact that I ever lived to see my 18th birthday. I went to the wrong party one night, I snorted and shot up the wrong drugs, and I ended up in a Cadillac tooling down Interstate 5 south towards Portland. There were 6 people in that caddy, 5 niggers and me. They pulled off the interstate at the Highway 12 exit going towards Aberdeen. At that time there was an abandoned gas station about half a mile down Highway 12. And that's where the blacks took me. They had been there before and so they had a key. We were all there for the next 24 hours. I think you can guess what they did to me, which was everything. Then they left me there for dead. I damn near was. I had a number of broken bones and severe internal bleeding and organ damage. Oh Christ, moaned Don. Ma'am, don't be stupid, she ordered briskly. It was half a century ago, and if I hadn't learned to accept it and to live with it, I wouldn't be here. After another 24 hours or so, I was able to crawl out of the building to the highway. A motorist saw me in his headlights. Just before he ran over me, he stopped and called for help. A team of paramedics from Tenino responded. There was also a Thurston County Sheriff's deputy with them, a young man of 22, just out of his training course in Olympia, and this was his first night duty. That young man's name was Ed M.C. Canlis. I'd tell you all the rest, but I don't have time. Colonel, whatever else you must ask us over this Trudy Griner business, can we leave the so-called background out when my husband returns? You got it, said Redmond. Absolutely, agreed Nell. Ed M.C. Canlis returned and sat down again. Young woman, sold a Crowley Thoth tarot deck and a pack of black votive candles, he said to Brittany. She's casting a curse, or trying to, said Brittany. Do you know her? She's a friend of Danielle Haywood's, said Ed. Don't know her name, the little black-haired girl, asked Brittany. Yup. I'll get in touch with Danielle and see what I can do to put a stop to whatever she's planning, said Brittany. She looked at the men. Poor kid is probably upset because a man dumped her and now she's going to try and get even with him, or with the girl she was dumped for, or both. That's no reason to start cutting loose with negative psychic energy. I try to be responsible, Colonel. I'd appreciate it if you would mention that fact to Sarah. I will, ma'am, Don assured her. He knew that his wife was an extremely high-ranking priestess in the Wiccan community. Sarah seldom volunteered information on that part of her life, and he never asked. Theirs was an ancient division of labor in Aryan marriages since the beginning of time. Don was the man and he dealt with the material world, while Sarah was the woman who dealt with the home, the spiritual and metaphysical aspects of life. I would like to ask you some things about the meeting, which took place in the safe house in Hoodsport, the night before the Ravenhill incident, when they were setting up the attack on the Special Criminal Court in Port Orchard. Yes, I remember. I was security officer for that meeting, said Ed. I followed SOP to the letter. I had some of the H.A. Covington, latest anti-bugging detection gear our geeky science kids had come up with, and I swept the whole house for any hidden microphones or fiber optics. There was nothing. Then when our people arrived, I swept them for bugs and made sure everyone's cell phone was turned off when they entered the house. Including Trudy Griner's phone, asked Redmond. Yes, although in her case it wasn't necessary since hers was on the fritz anyway. She had some Chinese off-brand phone and the communication satellite it was routed through had crashed into the ocean that morning. The Chinks were never as on top of their space program as we are. Colonel, as lame as this sounds in view of what happened that morning, I want you to know that I did my job. I will swear on my deathbed that no one in that house during that sit-down was wired or made any kind of contact with anyone they shouldn't have been in contact with. Trudy Griner arrived at the safe house at what time? Asked Redmond. A little before 1 o'clock in the morning, I believe, recalled McCandless. She was coming from Bremerton. And she left when? Sometime around 3 o'clock. She was supposed to be helping Joe Cord and Dave Leach at the emergency aid station, which was somewhere to the north. Polsbo, Brittany reminded him. Yes, of course you're correct, my love, acknowledged MC Canless with a nod. My understanding is that she didn't show up. And she left in her own car, a white Nissan? Asked Nell. Yes, so I recall, said MC Canless. Why? Where did she go? We don't know. That vehicle was never found, either by us or so far as we can tell by the local authorities or the feds either. Mr. MC Canless, I know this was a very long time ago, but please try and remember. We know that someone called Major Woodrow Coleman of the Fat Pose at almost precisely 2 o'clock that morning, said Redmond. Did Trudy Griner leave the room where the meeting was being held around that time, even for a few moments, or anyone else for that matter? MC Canless shook his head. Colonel, I know it seems odd for me to insist that after all these years I can be positive, but I was security officer in charge of monitoring the meeting, and I was also a former policeman, trained to be on the lookout for anything unusual. I meant what I said. I am willing to take my oath even today that no one in that house made any kind of call without my knowledge, nor was anyone out of my line of sight long enough to do so. Something else has come up, said Redmond. Mrs. M.C. Canless, were either of you aware of the fact that while Melanie Young was an openly committed Christian, according to our information, Tom Murdoch was a follower of the Aesir? It was fairly common knowledge, yes, among those of us who took an interest in the spiritual aspect of the struggle, said Brittany. Most didn't. Most of the volunteers were simply ordinary white people who had finally had enough of America's shit. They only knew that they would rather die than live one more day under Zog, and they didn't care what god or gods any other white man or woman worshipped. Did anyone in the column take an undue interest or offense at the, metaphysical incongruities involved in the Murdoch-Melanie situation? Did Joseph Cord do so, for example? Back to Joe Cord again, eh? Said MC Canless with a wry smile. He must have really pissed you off. Well, yeah, kind of, admitted Redmond with a sigh. Don't sweat it. He pisses everybody off. I see where you are leading, Colonel, said MC Canless. All I can tell you is that you're wrong. Joe Cord's eccentricities in the religious department were just that, eccentricities. They would never involve treason. As much as I dislike the man, I will swear that's the truth. And no one else seemed to object, pressed Redmond. No one else cared, Colonel, just as no one ought to care today. We were rather too busy most of the time to worry about such things at all, said MC Canless. In case you have forgotten, there was a rather large army of political gangsters trying to kill us all. Redmond changed tack. Mrs. MC Canless, one of the things that we are trying to explore as extensively as it's possible to do after all these years is the exact nature of the personal relationship between Tom Murdoch, Trudy Griner, and Melanie Young. From what we, H. Covington, have been able to gather, it sounds rather like a typical love triangle, but of course under those conditions, nothing was typical. Looking for a motive for Trudy to betray the column? Asked Brittany. Let's just say I am trying to understand the whole situation, Scope the big picture, so to speak. You were with Murdoch longer than most, and you're also a woman. Can you give me any informed insight on that aspect of things? You mean, was there the occasional bit of girl talk between me and Trudy and Melanie? Asked Brittany with a rueful smile. Exactly, ma'am, said Redmond imperturbably. Well, yes, there was some. First off, Melanie Young loved Tom Murdoch with a love that was utterly incandescent, and he returned that love. I have never seen anything like it before or since. That part of our national legend is 100% true. As for Trudy, she was a brave and noble woman, and she ended up being an also-ran, which humiliation I never believed she deserved. I will tell you quite frankly that when Tom Murdoch left her for Melanie Young, Trudy was utterly devastated. And do you know what she did? What, ma'am? Asked Redmond. She ate it, Colonel, said Brittany. She took it right on the chin and she drove on. We had a world to win and personal considerations were secondary. Because her role in life was not of the heart, it was of the blood, and she knew that and accepted it. Trudy Griner was a political soldier of the Aryan race, Colonel Redmond, at least up until the time she betrayed us all, if indeed she did so. It is part of a soldier's duty to endure pain. Pain of all kinds. Insofar as I could tell, Trudy endured the pain of Tom Murdoch and Melanie Young as she would have endured any bullet or shrapnel wound. There is one other thing that I need to ask you about, said Redmond. I apologize yet again for raking up these particular dry old bones, but one never knows just what may prove to be relevant. It is my understanding that before you joined the party, both of you were briefly members of the Pierce cult. Yes, that's true, admitted Ed. If you found that in our files, then you also know that back at the turn of the century, Pierce was all there was. The Northwest migration was only just beginning to appear on the radar screen by the middle of the first decade. We were associated with the cult for less than a year, and we both immediately resigned when it finally came out after his death that William Pierce had been a long-term federal government informant, as did virtually everyone else involved who had any sense of decency or integrity. The day after our resignations, Britt and myself called the old man, explained who we were, and offered our services. He accepted. We have been completely devoted to the party ever since. We have had no contact with the remnants of the Pierces since then except very occasionally, and then we urged them to drop all that crap, quit fooling around, and come home. You know what the weirdest thing about all that is to me? Put in Brittany. The fact is that to this very day, there are still some poor, wretched white people living in what's left of the United States who refuse to come home, who denounce the Republic because it isn't all of America. We're not ideologically pure, you see. Well, we're not, laughed Nell. No, Sergeant, we're not, agreed Brittany with a smile. That's what so bemuses me. The fact is that Pierce succeeded in his odd way. There are still a few tragic old people who think he's the Messiah, some kind of prophet who will somehow rise from the grave and restore all of America to our people at one magical swoop. They think that the Turner Diaries is just around the corner. They don't understand that it's already happened, right here in the Northwest, and they would rather live surrounded by the living mud than come home and give up their beloved illusions. It's so sad. Yes, ma'am, I am aware of that phenomenon, said Redmond. I'm also aware that in most cases it isn't quite as esoteric as you think with those people. I know because President Morgan gets hate mail from the Pierces to this day, and it passes across my desk in case any of them might be nutty enough to try something against him or against the old man. It's really the old man they hate. Every religion has to have its devil, its principle of ultimate evil, and the old man is the Pierce cult's devil, has been for a very long time, even before the old man himself came home. He did the ultimate evil in their eyes. He proved that he was right, and their great guru William Pierce was wrong, and they will never forgive him for it. These people would quite literally rather exist in the living hell of H. Covington. Racial America than come home and thereby admit that the old man was right. It is completely irrational, but then our race has always been capable of great irrationality. Now I have a purely personal question, just to satisfy my own curiosity. You are practitioners of the old religion, said Redmond. What do you feel when you hear our national anthem? Colonel, if you have read my file, then you know that 7 months after the Olympic flying column was destroyed, I was arrested in Spokane by the FBI, said Brittany. Ed started to say something. Ed, no, she said sharply. You did absolutely the right thing when you turned and walked away back down the street. There were too many of them. If you had pulled down on them, then we'd both be dead. Ed started to say something, angry and upset and ashamed. Redmond raised his hand. Sir, General Order Number 8 was not issued by the NVA for no reason. It was vitally necessary, and it was also an order. You were duty-bound to obey it. Since you are both here and together, sir, it is entirely obvious to me that you did in fact do the right thing. Please continue, Mrs. M.C. Canlis. They never bothered to charge me with anything. By that time, we'd moved beyond all that legal bullshit. I was white, I had a gun, so I was a Jerry Reb, end of story. Zog sent me to the women's camp in Pullman. I will not go into what happened to me. It was in some ways worse than what happened when I was 17, but it was long ago, it is over, and it's not important now. She glanced over at her husband. I will tell you that when I was in Pullman Federal Detention Facility, Kathy Frost was kept 3 cells down and across the corridor from me. The rest of us were warehoused, in large bay-like cells, with 20 or 30 women in each. Overcrowded, but you could at least stand up and move around a bit, sit against a wall and meditate, and we had a thin pallet each we could stretch out on. Kathy had her own cell, all 4x4x4 of it. Those monsters used to fold her up like paper when they'd finished with her to stuff her back inside. Every 3rd or 4th night, for 6 months, I heard the officers of the law of the United States of America come and take her to the interrogation room, where they desperately tried to force her to confess and name those whom they wanted her to name. And every night she was in there, at her own request, we did the only thing we could do for her. All night long, at 3 or 4 minute intervals necessary to recover our voices, all 90 women on that block sang. We sang with every ounce of our hearts and souls, our voices sometimes even drowning out the sound of her screams of mortal agony. Over and over again, we sang Kathy's favorite hymn. That was "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." The federal guards would come in and hit us with water hoses. They dragged us out of the cells by our hair and shocked us with electric cattle prods. They beat us with their nightsticks, with padlocks and socks. They flogged us with stretched-out wire coat hangers to try and silence us. But we kept singing, and after a time they stopped trying to prevent us. It was as if they understood that we would never be broken, and all of a sudden it was they who were afraid of us. We sang the hymn in English, and because there were women from many different nations among us, after a while we could sing it in the original German, in French, in Norwegian, in Russian, in Italian, in Polish, in Afrikaans. The words of that hymn are burned into my memory in a dozen languages. Kathy Frost was a believing Christian, and regardless of our own religious beliefs, we all gave her without stint that which she needed to survive and triumph over what those beasts who wore suits as if they were men did to her. That hymn was a form of magic, Colonel. It was then and it is today. It was written by a great man who was touched with the divine spirit, and it was sanctified by centuries of faith. No, sir, I do not begrudge my Christian fellow citizens of this republic one single word of our national anthem. Kathy Frost earned it for them. Every word, every note, every syllable. I sang it with pride 30-odd years ago, Colonel, as a maiden. I sing it with pride today as a crone, and I know that neither the god nor the goddess take offense, for they were always admirers of courage wherever